Hello, everybody. My name is Pablo Boczkowski. I am a faculty member at Northwestern University and the director of the Center for Latinx Digital Media. Thank you so much for joining us for today's weekly virtual seminar of the Center. It is really a pleasure to have you with us. The mission of the Center is to create knowledge about digital media in Latinx and Latin American communities across the Americas. Today's speaker is a leading scholar in this space. Melissa Villa-Nicolas is an assistant professor in the Graduate School of Library and Information Studies at the University of Rhode Island. Valerie Gruest, a doctoral student at Northwestern University and an affiliate of the Center for Latinx Digital Media, will introduce Melissa in just a minute. I am delighted to know that this quarter our series is co-sponsored by the Alice Kaplan Institute for the Humanities, the Buffett Institute for Global Affairs, the Center for Global Culture and Communication, the Department of Communication Studies, the Department of Radio, Television, and Film, and the Program in Latin American and Caribbean Studies. But before we go to the seminar, I'd like to start by acknowledging that Northwestern is a community of learners situated within a network of historical and contemporary relationships with Native American tribes, communities, parents, students, and alumni. It is also in close proximity to an urban Native American community in Chicago and near several tribes in the Midwest. The Northwestern campus sits on the traditional homelands of the people of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Ottawa, as well as the Menominee, Miami, and Ho-Chunk nations. It was also a site of trade, travel, gathering, and healing for more than a dozen other native tribes, and is still home to over 100,000 tribal members in the state of Illinois. It is within Northwestern's responsibility as an academic institution to disseminate knowledge about Native peoples and the institution's history with them. Consistent with the university's commitment to diversity and inclusion, Northwestern works towards building relationships with Native American communities through academic pursuits, partnerships, historical recognitions, community service, and enrollment efforts. Let me say briefly a little bit more about how the seminar will unfold. First, Valerie will tell us more about Melissa's research and career in just a minute. Then Melissa will present her work. After that, we will open for questions. Please enter your questions in the Q&A function of the webinar at the bottom of the screen at any point in time. Valerie will moderate. At the end, we will deliver some closing remarks. Once again, many thanks for joining us, and without further ado, Valerie, the screen is all yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. Pablo, thank you very much for having me as a moderator for the seminar. It is an absolute honor for me to introduce our guest speaker for today. Dr. Melissa Villa-Nicolas holds a BA in Global Studies and American Literature from Azusa Pacific University, an MA in Cultural Studies from Claremont Graduate University, an MA in Library and Information Studies from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and a PhD in Information Science with a focus in queer theory from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Professor Villa-Nicolas's work focuses on the Latinx histories and practices of information and technology, immigrant information rights, and critical approaches to information science. She is currently an assistant professor in the Graduate School of Library and Information Studies at the University of Rhode Island. She has served in multiple endeavors within the academic field and was involved in the Voices for Information Equity webinar series. Dr. Villa-Nicolas is also the author of an extensive selection of books, peer-reviewed publications, book chapters, edited journals, and media features. Her most recent work includes Latinas on the Line, Invisible Labor in Telecommunications, Digitizing the Latina Information Worker, Designing the Good Citizen Through Latina Identity in USCIS's Virtual Assistant, Emma, amongst many others. She has received numerous grants, making a very strong contribution to the field and receiving numerous awards for her research. Most recently, she received the Diversity and Inclusive Excellence Award from URI, and over the years, she has been an active member in the field through her service and scholarly experiences. We are so honored to have Dr. Villa-Nicolas today to share with us her knowledge and experience. Thank you so much. And as a reminder to our audience, please submit your questions in the Q&A function on Zoom, which is located at the bottom of your screen. We will address these questions in the Q&A portion at the end of the webinar. And with that, Dr. Villa-Nicolas, the screen is all yours.
Thank you so much, Valerie, and thank you, Pablo, and thank you to the Center for this invite. I've been a fan of the Center for a while, I've been following all of your work, so it's exciting for me to be invited. All right, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And I'll play my slides. So thank you again. I'm here at the University of Rhode Island on Narragansett land, and I'm grateful to Narragansett Nation for the land that we reside on. They've asked residents to care for that land carefully, so our family tries to do that. And I follow Narragansett on their lead for land back movements and whatever they ask of us. So thank you all. So I want us to take a moment to reflect on our entrances into what I call data borders. And I'll do that by just sharing this screen to demonstrate some of our entrances into this state of data borders. So sort of raise your hand mentally or check the box if you use any of the following: Amazon, LexisNexis, maybe to do research or to write papers, Thomson Reuters, walking in public, using the post office, or going to the DMV. These are just some, thank you for raising your hand. I saw that. These are just some of the ways in which we enter into this state of data borders. And there's been a lot of work on this through journalism and especially through FOIA requests and government documents. But there's a lot of folks out there who are sort of unveiling this entrance into different public and private organizations' contracts with ICE. So we're increasingly seeing Latinx immigrant data and particularly biodata engaged at the surface for which information technology is mobilized. Recent investment in the collection of data and biodata on the US-Mexico border and throughout the country has become a highly profitable industry. Companies such as Quanergy, Anduril, BI2, Palantir, Clearview AI, and DNA testing companies all have a stake in gathering data of undocumented people in ports of entries, borderlands, detention centers, and immigrant populated cities, and subsequently US citizens' data as well. While surveillance and contentious relations along the US-Mexico border is not new, what is new is the scale and this large collaboration, especially emerging between Silicon Valley and the Defense Department. Truthout estimates that by 2023, the border technology industry will be a $740 billion industry. I named this phenomenon data body milieu. Data body milieu is the emergent state of borderland surveillance that brings all residents into intimate places of surveillance where our data lives together and defines us in a digital borderlands and places Latinx immigrant data at the center of technological innovation and development. Borderland milieu is a term that was defined and described by Oscar Martinez, coined by his deep study of how people live along the US-Mexico border. They form relationships, culture merges, and sometimes culture is appropriated. They have tense and frictious relationships, and they adopt each other's values. Borderland milieu, defined by Martinez, is the unique forces, processes, and characteristics that set borderlands apart from interior zones, including transnational interaction, international conflict and accommodation, ethnic conflict and accommodation, and separateness. In their totality, these elements constitute what might be called a borderland milieu. Borders are geographic locations, but they're also imagined and made tangible based on geopolitics. For example, the US-Mexico border had not been a focus of immigration flow until the 1920s and beyond, when the US-Mexico border became more a tangible line patrolled and regulated in order to monitor illegal entries of Chinese immigrants by way of Mexico. Borders and the people that are excluded or included are often constructed physically and in the social imagination by way of immigration policy. the insiders and outsiders of those imagined communities that political scientist Benedict Anderson names make up this influx boundary. Borderland theory argues that borders are not always geographic locations, but rather include consciousness and identity formation. So authors like Gloria Ansaldúa have observed that Latinx immigrant communities' borderland experiences have multiple meanings and are deeply personal and intimate experiences of living in an in-between state. Borderlands engage in material and social exchanges and individual subjective experiences of inequities, personal belief systems, and living in interstitial cultures. Latinx immigrants have long navigated borderlands in their everyday lives. So this in-betweenness emerges often in Latinx thought around identity, migration, and border theory, or what Chicana studies theorist Angie Chabram-Dernasessian calls the multifocality of Latinx immigrant communities' experiences in the United States. Ansaldúa named borderland consciousness as a constantly shifting process that allows for contradictions and new identities from hybrid cultures. Borderlands then are geographic and they travel through subjective identity consciousness. Digital cultural theorist Felix Stadler first named the data body as a shadow body that follows us through classification and measurement. It increases with every digitized byte of data from citizens' consumption, such as credit cards and grocery purchases and online bill payments. Of course, this data body comes with a series of rewards and necessities for life chances, but this data body also networks into the same systemic oppression of race, gender, and sexuality that critical and information technology theorist Sophia Noble has named as technological redlining. This data body then echoes and often exacerbates the inequities of the physical body. The data body perceives itself, as Stadler says. And in the technological redlining for access to quality of life chances, such as health insurance, home loans, and credit cards, as well as green lights easily traveling through borders. Activists and community organizers, the Our Data Bodies Project states, our data body can follow behind us like a digital shadow, impacting the choices and opportunities we face. Excuse me. Though our data bodies are mostly digital, the collection, analysis, and sharing data have a profound impact on our ability to meet our basic material needs. Excuse me. I've been sick, so I apologize. So we see justification for building these surveillance technologies, expanding the data bodies, excuse me, as what Ruha Benjamin calls the new Jim Code, where technologies that harm Black communities are justified through efficiency. So about the new Jim Code, she says the employment of new technologies reflect and reproduce existing inequities, but are promoted and perceived as progress. Data body Milieu then is our social media data and library databases and DMV databases working together to build a new borderland for surveillance and deportations. It's that sense that your information is somehow linked to a massive surveillance project happening with ICE. Latinx immigrants are valued as a data for purpose of technological design. We see Silicon Valley physically reshaping around US-Mexico borderlands, and United States citizens engage in a constant state of borderland surveillance to an extent which they intimately are entangled with undocumented data surveillance. My hope with this work is to begin to name the state of data borders, a borderland in which we are always already residing by way of our data and information technologies. I apologize, I've been sick, so I was hoping I could get through it. So in this lecture, I want to outline emerging trends of this data borderland, the US-Mexico border as Silicon Valley, Latinx immigrants hailed as data as grounds for technological innovation, and intimate and public entrances into data borders. And then I always like to focus on methods for organizing for immigrant data rights. So this research uses public-facing information, tech companies' contracts with ICE, government documents, mainstream media coverage, leaked government files, advertising, and other electronic resources as electronic resources. And I also interview Latinx immigrant communities from my hometown. I lead with qualitative research from undocumented people about their experience with information technology experiences. I interviewed 14 people over the past 5 years who are from Mexican immigrant communities in Riverside County. That's where I'm from. They varied from undocumented, DACA, permanent resident, and naturalized citizens from 18 years old to 60 years old. So these folks from my hometown, these are friends and family friends. They live under intense surveillance in Riverside County. Border patrols often seen driving around our cities. There's a border patrol checkpoint in Temecula, in the adjacent city. There's a border detention center in Marietta, where I'm from, that has been written up for inhumane living situations. And then Lake Elsinore, where the communities that I interviewed are located, are often the site of ICE raids. I follow a feminist ethnographic framework. I recognize my own subjective past experiences are part of the study, and I approach my own experiences as part of this study as well. Feminist ethnography recognizes and attempts to resist the potential to other the research subjects. So I just wanted to give an example of how entrenched like my hometown is with this data border. This is a job ad for a ICE senior analyst in Marietta, where my interviews took place. And if you look at the job ad, part of the job description is to be able to use Thomson Reuters and LexisNexis databases to search for data. So that's sort of the emerging type of surveillance happening. And there's a history of anti-immigrant policy in the towns, in these more conservative towns in Riverside, California. So the folks that I interviewed are like highly subjected to surveillance. Many people had been deported before and had been through ICE raids in their hometowns. I prioritize data privacy through several avenues, including IRB approval. I kept data private by writing down our interviews. I use pseudonyms, and I receive grant funds to pay people for their time. And I only interview people who know and trust me personally. I use this as a method I find antithetical to anonymous and consentless practices of big data and data gathering. I approach this work as counter data storytelling to big data surveillance practices. Information science scholar Leticia Velez says counter storytelling are a means for minorities to share their experiences and to counter existing hegemonic narratives. Counter data initiatives, as established by D'Ignazio and Klein's data feminist methods, interrupts dominant narratives that are built into Western values around technology as progress, and especially Silicon Valley story structure. I engage these methods intentionally to value small data and resist the overfunding of big data. So I'm in conversation with a lot of wonderful critical science and technology scholars who interrogate information technologies and how they reproduce and challenge power. Kathy O'Neill has raised the red flag on data processing and mathematics, finding how mathematics and quantitative data is used to organize citizens' everyday lives. Internet scholar Sophia Noble observes that these technologies such as algorithms and Google search are not neutral, but in fact deeply intertwined with race, gender, sexuality, power dynamics that structure our everyday lives. Sarah Lambden is a scholar in information science who has a new book out called Data Cartels. She calls these emerging tech companies that collaborate with ICE data cartels because cartels are groups of independent market participants who collude to improve their profits and dominate the market. They operate in the same sphere of business as an alliance of rivals. So she goes deep into especially the databases such as Thomson Reuters and RELEX groups that gather data and have contracts with ICE, but also are used in academic settings for writing research papers or are used by lawyers for doing legal work. And then Ivan Char Lopez demonstrates the history of borderland technology along the US-Mexico border. He'll have his book coming out as well. He asserts that state building happens by way of technology, drawing a racial line of exclusion and inclusion around undesired Latinx immigrants and their border patrol and the border patrol in that area. So my work builds on this scholarship, and I bring in interviews with undocumented people and immigrant communities who cross the US-Mexico border in the San Ysidro border. And I lead with my interview qualitative data to sort of look for the patterns that emerge in this partnership between Silicon Valley and ICE. I circle around the questions such as how are most people in the US now connected to ICE systems of surveillance? How are technologies designed around Latinx immigrant data? How are US residents' data bodies living outside of our physical bodies? How are most people experiencing a borderland by way of their data, whether they're conscious of it or not? And what does it mean that many people's data is in a constant state of correlation to ICE systems of surveillance, but we can't feel those borderlands? So that, for me, it's important. Like, I grew up closer to the San Ysidro borderland, and so I think, you know, we could physically see Border Patrol. I saw my mom questioned by Border Patrol. I knew people that were deported, but we don't have that same affective sense of a borderland when we're like using Amazon or researching our papers. So I want to know, like, what does it mean when we don't have an affective consciousness to a borderland that we're anchored into? Okay, this is a real quick interlude, but I kind of have to do it because I don't want to propagate this idea that it's like technology versus Latinx immigrants. Latinx immigrants have a history of technology building in the US. I like to go back to the traqueros, Mexican migrant men who helped build the railroads in the US as a sort of baseline. But if anyone else can go back further, or like at the same time, I'd love to see that as well. And there's been a lot of work done, great work done on traqueros, but I kind of anchor histories of Latinx and technology all the way back to those first systems of telecommunications being built with the trains. And one theme that kind of emerges in Latinx histories of technologies is that Latinx immigrants are often sort of like perceived as, or sort of there's this trope that Latinx immigrants are biologically suited to do a certain type of technological labor. So like the hard work, the traqueros were praised for being able to like work in these hard labor conditions in any environment. Maquiladora workers there's this trope that they were praised as being able to work on electronics, and these are especially Latina Mexican women. They were said that they have delicate hands to be able to build electronics in the maquiladoras. So there's kind of these ongoing patterns that Latinx immigrants are like biologically suited to do the hardest labor of building technologies. I also have in there Latinx librarians have a history that like was simultaneous to Chicano rights movement of like they were building databases, they were thinking about how to electronically store information in the 60s, the 70s and 80s, you know, and they were doing that at the same time like as the Chicano rights movement. So they were questioning classification schemas and how to archive Latin American research, while also like with this eye towards Chicano rights. Latinas have a history as telephone operators in the US with the 1970s in major telecommunications companies. There's also like the digital discussion around digital divides. So there's historically been this gap in Latinx folks being able to access like modern technologies, but that doesn't necessarily mean Latinx folks are without technological history. So I had to put that in there as kind of a like counter to this like gaze of Latinx folks being marginalized or like not necessarily having a place in these technological histories. So what we see is an emerging trend of the reorganization of Silicon Valley in the US-Mexico border and the US-Mexico border influencing Silicon Valley. The first talk of a virtual wall began in 2006 by the Department of Homeland Security border initiative, a large deal with Boeing to build SBInet, which was considered a failed project, but sort of created the infrastructure that Silicon Valley would later go on to build off of. In the 2010s, we saw a shift from defense companies such as Boeing and Elbit building borderland technology, which they still do build borderland technologies, but there was a shift to bid for Silicon Valley companies to work with government contracts for sort of a new digital innovation around Latinx immigrant surveillance in the border. And in 2010, we saw a geographic shift where Silicon Valley companies started moving to geographic borderlands, and the Department of Homeland Security moved itself to Silicon Valley. So the Department of Homeland Security opened a satellite office in Silicon Valley in 2015. And with that, there's a lot of language around innovation and technological collaboration. And then companies such as Quanergy Electric, who built light detection and ranging technology. So they built like the technology that runs the self-driving cars or anything self-driving. Companies like that relocate or have annexes along the US-Mexico border in order to test these technologies in that terrain. So we see a sort of a flip and a reorganization so that Silicon Valley is geographically located in the borderlands, and Department of Homeland Security is more located within Silicon Valley for a partnership. In 2018, Congress approved the budget for a virtual border wall known as a smart wall, and US-Mexico borderlands became more of a testing lab for new surveillance technology. This is a quick video I wanted to show real quick, just to demonstrate how tech is being tested in the borderlands. I'm just going to show a minute.
Tech companies are trying to make it easier for Border Patrol agents to do their jobs and also come up with an effective border solution that would be cheaper for taxpayers than building a physical wall. The Government Accountability Office estimates that could cost $18 billion.
That's the LiDAR sensor.
One company called Quanergy has been flying here from Silicon Valley for a year to test its surveillance system. Quanergy took LiDAR technology it developed for self-driving cars and built out a high-tech virtual border wall. It can detect movement within 360 degrees and 200 meters of the sensor. The software can tell the difference between people and animals. It would then send alerts to Border Patrol when people are detected.
What LiDAR has the ability to do is to give you pre-buffer warning, to say at 100 meters that something is approaching, be aware. And then by the time they 5 meters away, as an example, well, okay, this is a serious issue. Hopefully by then the security forces have been mobilized and are ready to respond to what might be at the perimeter.
Okay, so that was just one example, but there are many, many companies sort of proposing and bidding for new technologies along the US-Mexico border. Let's escape out of this. Okay, so when I spoke to my interview collaborators who had crossed the border without papers, they associated emerging border technologies with danger. The more surveillance technologies along the border, the more that people crossing would have to take dangerous steps to evade them. And the political discourse around these technologies is that it's safer than a physical wall. It tends to be a bipartisan collaboration as an alternative to a physical wall. 39-year-old Juana, who had come when she was younger and lives in Lake Elsinore, California, discussed often how these emerging technologies were making the border more dangerous, a sentiment that is antithetical to politicians who support the smart wall. She said, right now, I think they're using a lot of technology for everything. I remember when they first started using what they were using when they could see humans just walking, when they started with the drones. A man told me you have to cover your own footprints because of the technology of tracing the footprints. The cameras, it seems impossible to come here. I mean, it's not, they need to make it safer for people crossing in general, so it's not about them being watched. In my interviews, developing information technologies and data tracking on the border were directly correlated with danger. And there was an increasing awareness of these technologies among undocumented DACA and naturalized citizens as a warning in the borderlands. So immigrants in these borderlands are increasingly hailed as data and as an information product sold. Information that improves algorithms and as test subjects for new technology without their consent. As undocumented people, they are often outside of the scope of ethics that include citizens and some permanent residents from exploitive data collection. There's this zeal for new technological innovation that reflects a revival of technological innovation and the American spirit of competition for immigrant data. The coding of these technologies is built around the gaze of the Latinx undocumented person as an object to capture, therefore making immigrant data at the center of information technology design. The drive for Latinx immigrants' datafication around the border relies on narratives that Latinx have previously had little or no history in the development of technology, or that they are biologically suited for technology to be developed around. So one example of how Latinx immigrants are being datafied is a company called Coolfire Core. They are one of many companies proposing AI models for the digital wall. According to Coolfire, we help people operating on the front lines, struggling to make decisions, challenging with doing what is right. We empower everyday people to be everyday heroes. Coolfire describes their digital wall as a row of in-ground sensors and cameras and motion detectors that will alert if there's a human in the area. In this model, Latinx immigrants are perceived or designed around as an unpredictable object with no data and visualized usually as the object to be captured. So there are other companies such as Anduril, which are hardware companies that demonstrate how they use drones to capture technology along the Southern California border. In an NBC News special on Anduril, an NBC correspondent starts the segment with an image of a man walking through these borderlands. Sensors and cameras identify his location, and there's a drone called Ghost, which flies in closer to identify the man. The narrative structure here is clear. In exchange for heavy borderland surveillance and centralizing Latinx immigrants as object to capture, emerging tech companies will bring citizens safely through with technology. Datafication reprises this enduring dilemma around this idea that there's a sort of what Leo Chavez calls the Latino threat. Datafication and these information technologies sort of suggest that the Latino threat can be tampered with information technologies. So what we see is an emergence of this commercial military hybrid products and a new industry forming. These new industries are praised by these Silicon Valley companies such as Anduril and Palantir as something that Silicon Valley had previously resisted, but that holding more contracts with ICE. And the Mehente and National Immigration Project have previously called this the cloud industrial complex because of the many tech companies that have FedRAMP authorizations that use cloud data to hold immigrant data and to sort of data mine immigrant data. I call it the military industrial startup complex because of the merger of hardware and software, commercial products, classification databases, and cloud services are the sort of mergers happening here. This is a quote from Palmer Luckey, who's the head of Anduril Industries. He was previously the founder of Oculus, which was merged with Facebook. But if you've used the Oculus goggles, virtual reality goggles, or if you've used any virtual reality goggles, he basically designed the original, more accessible virtual reality goggles. He says, in China, there's no difference between their civil sector and their military sector. It's all one thing. That's why when you help the Chinese companies work on artificial intelligence, you're almost directly helping Chinese military work on artificial intelligence. A lot of people in Silicon Valley don't really understand this. So this is sort of the goal for Anduril and Palantir and a lot of these merging companies, is to build more of a bridge from commercial to military, because it's all sort of like data that can improve the technology, and it's hailed as the next step in Silicon Valley industry. But there's a fraught tension there with companies that don't necessarily want to go this direction. So I call this the machine learning feedback loop. Latinx immigrants as data are valued for being captured on the border and valued for their data. And the more that data goes into a product, the more that product changes or improves by tech innovation standards. So if you have something like a drone or virtual reality goggles that are designed for commercial sector and they're used by Border Patrol, the data going in is constantly improving that technology, right? That technology improves, goes back out into the commercial market sector, and it improves through the commercial market sector, goes back out into defense industries. So we see this with, I mean, all of these companies, but there's not necessarily a division between commercial and military. And that's why it's this machine learning feedback loop where all of the data kind of feeds into itself to shift the technology, and it goes back out there. And that technology changes us, you know, the algorithms, virtual reality, especially work around the quantified self, is to sort of change us, and then we change the technology, but it's all sort of enmeshed with ICE and Border Patrol uses. So my interview collaborators were highly aware that they were being watched and datafied through their technology. They use technology for everyday lives on their smartphones, of course, with computers, video games, and technology was used as a supplement for citizenship. So they were constantly checking. I've interviewed people over the past, like since 2016. So it was like during the Trump presidency and the Biden presidency. So for DACA recipients, especially, they're constantly using their phones to check like the status of DACA. And of course, like as a bridge to information on applying for DACA or when DACA was going to be renewed. None of the people that I interviewed felt their information was private. So one important thing I think that's to take away here is like, none of the people I interviewed were unaware that, like, they knew they were a part of these data borders. They were quite conscious of it. It's kind of scary. 24-year-old Teresa, who has DACA status, since the Obama administration told me. She said, I know if I search sushi places near me, sushi stuff will pop up in other apps. It makes you wonder what else. I feel like if they really wanted to, they know where I am. And all of the people I interviewed recognized that technology was heavily shifting. So I know I should wrap up in a couple minutes, so I just will kind of go through these last slides, but I call this state where everyone is enmeshed with data that can be mined by ICE, or data that's going in and out of commercial products and military products as citizen milieu, but I cast citizen as residents, like all residents in that enter into these data borders. These happen through public and private spaces, such as the library and the post office and the DMV, and also through intimate home technologies, such as your virtual agents on your phone, or through Amazon. They are also happen through social media. So whatever your status, it's more likely than not you're networked into this. And it's a form of sort of participating in good citizenship, in the sense of producing more and more data is collaborating as a good citizen. Being fully online means becoming more and more of a hailed as a good citizen. One thing that folks can do, but it's not without like risk, is you can look at your data portfolio from LexisNexis. So LexisNexis is a very large data broker who buys and sells data. I did this and I got like 70 pages of my own data back, but I feel like it's with a privilege, like it's with citizenship privilege, that I feel like I can do this and get it back and not feel like I'm creating even more surveillance on myself. But whether you do it or not, like there's probably 70 pages of data on you. But I think it's one way of being able to like kind of extract that the ways in which we are enmeshed into this, to be able to see that data border. So I also call this state of citizen milieu retroactive privacy violation consciousness, in that we find out how we're enmeshed like years later. So folks in Louisiana and New Orleans in 2018 found out that they had been in this predictive analytic crime forecasting by Palantir since 2012. And so, you know, we find out the post office is using Clearview, or there's just so many ways that surveillance is happening so retroactively. It'll be like years later that we were conscious of this state. I'm going to go ahead and skip this part so that I can go to the little bit of the last part of what this book is, but I'll just say that the cultural framework of these companies is built around like a hero's journey. So Anduril and Palantir really build around these like Western stories, like Lord of the Rings, or Palantir has a database named Gotham. They bring people into this hero's journey of like the heroes designing these technologies, these surveillance technologies, and employees are kind of cast into fandom. Their mantra is save the Shire. They have like Hobbicons, but ultimately they're part of this hero's narrative in designing these technologies. Okay, so I know I need to wrap up. I have a part 2 in this book, and I call it Pero Querías Norte, or Pero Queríamos Norte, as a response to the storytelling that happens in designing these surveillance technologies. So when I spoke to a lot of my interview collaborators, Pero Queríamos Norte is a kind of common conclusion in a conversation that happens at least around Mexican immigrants or migrant communities, but it could also be other Latino immigrant communities. It's kind of just this term or rallying cry or a rallying call to go back to work in spite of difficult conditions. it directly translates to, but we wanted the North, or but you wanted the North. I kind of loved when this came up when we were talking, because I just think it's a phrase that gives agency back to people. Like it puts it back on their own terms. It's like, we knew this was how it was, this like working situation, this situation. We knew the xenophobic conditions and we made the journey anyways. So that's why I kind of came to love the saying that would come up or comes up around immigrant communities. I think it just embraces many frictions of immigrant life, and it's a way to bookend and give a final word back to immigrant communities, kind of back on immigrant communities, like a final word. So I want to, in my interviews, we talked about this idea of techno-imagined futures as a response to Silicon Valley surveillance and storytelling. This is built off of Ruha Benjamin and Sophia Noble, who both talk about imagination as a response to sort of heavy forms of surveillance and capitalism. And Ruha Benjamin says it comes from Afrofuturist and Chicano-futurist projects for liberatory purposes. So Ruha Benjamin says this work has a lot to teach us about reimagining the default settings, codes, and environments that we have inherited from prior regimes of racial control, and how we can appropriate and reimagine science and technology for liberatory ends. And then Sophia Noble, if you read her Algorithms of Oppression, she ends her book with what she calls the Imagine Engine. She just imagines different types of technologies for purposes of more of liberation. She says such imaginings are helpful in an effort to denaturalize and reconceptualize how information could be provided to the public vis-a-vis the search engine. So what I did, besides interviewing people about their experience crossing the border, their experience with surveillance technologies, is we also talked about how we would reimagine our cities, borders and border patrols, and what we would reimagine, how we would imagine technologies. It's not necessarily to like make encourage technological determinism, like technology equals progress, but just to reimagine in the face of surveillance technologies. So one response was from Oscar, who's in his 30s and crossed when he was younger and was deported a couple of times. He says, I would create an app that lets people start over with a fresh start, something that could have give immigrants the option of not having a record, clearing their record, like for people who've been deported 2 or 3 times, like people who change their names, giving people a new start. And then I start this book with Luce's Imagine Technology, which she says, Rapunzel's paintbrush, from this Rapunzel story that she knew, where Rapunzel could paint anything and walk through it. And she basically says she would paint a painting and go through to her mom's house in Mexico. She hadn't seen her mom in decades because she crossed without papers, and she just couldn't cross back. It was like the exchange she made for creating a new life for her daughters when she hasn't seen her mom. So I just thought like this idea totally kind of it looks past borders or citizenship, and it just is like to walk right through to see her mom and not necessarily give up the life that she's established. Okay, and so these are just a last couple of things. There's new themes arising in immigrant data rights, and there's a lot of groups working on that. So those are some of the groups. And as always, leading with policy and including undocumented people in data privacy. So as we think about like data privacy for citizens, including undocumented people in those policy movements. Oh, and I didn't get to say this, I'm sorry. The image here is, so Juana, one of my interview collaborators, writes to a lot of people who are incarcerated. And so one of the people she was writing to, Wedo, heard about this book, and he sent us this picture like as a response to hearing about the book. So I wanted to include it. as sort of a part, incarcerated people are also part of this larger surveillance project. And so their responses are also important. Okay, I'm sorry I talked over, but I'm going to stop there.
Thank you so much for such an interesting, wonderful, and really truly important presentation, Professor Villanicolas. I'll get us started with some initial questions for discussion. I thought this work dialogues really well with Professor Lisa Flores' presentation earlier this year here at the Center for Latinx Digital Media, which centered around, border spectacles and the mobilities of rhetorical race making. And I think there's a really good connection between her conceptualization of the spectacle of mobility and containment in border rhetoric and your lens of the data body centered at the intersection of border theory and technology, especially through the notions of, exclusion and inclusion to citizenship through the emergent state of borderland technology, which I thought was fascinating in your work. So I'm wondering, how are both the intimate and public entrances into data borders shaping immigrant mobilizations, either through, the border technology innovations or the applications, as you mentioned, within this complex process of monitoring and surveillance?
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. So the people that I'd been interviewing, I had been interviewing them for years about what technologies they were using. And then I just keep holding back on publishing because I don't want to create more data about people. But I think people are really aware that they're surveilled and they make the decision on what technologies to use. But I think especially the people that I interviewed that are in these really intense surveilled spaces, certainly weigh what they're going to use versus what's going to be maybe make them more anchored in. I think that they're very conscious about what technologies they can use. It's interesting because the people that I interviewed that had DACA, I feel like the people I interviewed that had DACA almost were the most constrained or aware of their limitations because they had to give all of their information up front. So I think they already felt like all of their information was there for DACA, and DACA was back and forth on whether it was going to continue or not. And I think they were maybe the most hesitant or the most aware and maybe felt like the most limited in movement and mobility, just from being overly conscious of how much data they had given to get DACA status. I don't know if that necessarily answers your question, but just thinking about from the people that I worked with, I just always think about, especially the intimate entrances, I felt like that came up the most, and the sort of restriction, it came up the most around the DACA recipients I had talked to.
Okay, no, thank you so much for that response. That's very interesting. And now Mora has a question. So Mora, the screen is yours.
Yes, thank you so much, Professor Villanicolas, for this really important talk. I have a question that maybe is related to Val's question. Did you find any sort of what Finn Branton and Helen Nissenbaum have called in their book obfuscation techniques or tactics? That is, do you see with this, thinking about techno-social futures, right, which was your last slide, do you find in this context of a high awareness of surveillance techniques and surveillance consciousness, do you find beyond the selection of technologies, right, any kind of obfuscation technique that is trying to disseminate misleading information as a way of protecting oneself from surveillance, right? Do you find any of that in your interviews?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely did it. It's funny because I start what I say is part 2 as it's definitely there. And then I just removed it as much as possible because again, I didn't want to create more data, and I just don't know what is known, which is part of what I'm kind of saying in this, there's this sort of uncertainty constantly about how we're networked into this and how undocumented folks are being watched or are networked in. And so yeah, I mean, one thing I think is so clear, and the folks I interviewed had crossed like in the 80s and 90s, and some more recently who were deported and crossed again. And it's like there's always a lot of technological innovation for crossing, but the tech that's used is like the helicopter or drones or like dogs, like it's like it makes the stakes higher, and so like more obfuscation has to happen, and that's like it makes it more dangerous. Like that's what I found more and more, but I really removed that part from the interviews again because I just didn't know what like was already out there, and that's part of what I kind of call this state of data body milieu, is like we literally just don't know like what is a part of these surveillance. But yeah, that there's just so many tactics that people use to cross. And I mean, especially from the area that I'm from, because I don't know if as much because ICE deportation like has happened in different ways lately, but like when we were growing up, there was a lot of like ICE or raids in certain areas where we were growing up, and people knew where they were. And if this was an old thing, so I think I can talk about it, but like in the 90s or like in the 2000s, like if people saw a raid happening, like there was immediately a texting network that would happen, like to get people to not necessarily go to those areas. So I think it's just like it's so built in to different communities, like to be aware and to be kind of relaying that to each other. And it happens, I mean, like the way people evade technologies on the border, I mean, it's just like very innovative, but also like the more technologies, the more higher the stakes and the more dangerous it becomes.
Thank you so much.
And now Facundo also has a question.
Yes, thank you, Val, and thank you, Professor Vila Nicolas, for this very important presentation, as Val and Mora said. I really like that, like the work, because we were just talking before the talk about like the history, like the previous work you conducted on like the relationship between like Latinx communities and technology work. And I was also thinking, because you said that the importance of context and history, like understanding these broader relationships. I'm also curious about how do you see like beyond the change of the scale that you mentioned, of how like these new technoscientific surveillance change the scale, but if there, because the relationship between like the military force and technology is also like obviously like almost foundational of the technology and communication is based on the relation with military force. So this is something that is not new. So how do you see like this relationship between like military forces, technology companies, or companies at large, not necessarily technology companies, and the relation or the role of the state and the nation state? Because you also mentioned in a quote that someone was referring to China, and also was very curious about what is unique about the US and what is like different or like comparable with other countries, or like a general relationship between the states, companies, and technology.
Yeah, thanks. I think that these companies that have started building out their contracts with ICE, they have like a cultural, I think they perceive themselves as like they have some cultural work to do to persuade other companies to kind of have more contracts with ICE, and to really, I think, move towards like really having these products in both like surveillance, like ICE, Border Patrol, and commercial products. So there's one clip that I didn't get to show, but it's like, it's a guy kind of geeking out over, I think it's actually called like a geek something about the Anduril drone called the Ghost drone. And his whole pitch is like, I really hope we can purchase these eventually. So I think one move that's happening is like, these companies would really like the products that are right there. And there's not necessarily division like for some of them, but Anduril has pretty much openly said like, they would like the drone that you see there tested in the border to be able to be purchased also by commercial markets, or virtual reality goggles that are used by Border Patrol to also be pitched. So I think we're just going to see more of like that direct connection straight into markets. And companies like Palantir and Anduril, it's like something that they've been trying to do is to pitch this more towards Silicon Valley companies, that like culture, to make it more culturally palatable, I think. Recently, Palantir moved out of Silicon Valley, like geographically, and to Colorado, and their sort of goodbye letter was like, you all just don't understand us, like you don't get what we're trying to do. And Anduril has had that friction as well. And so there's this moment of friction where like they really want the more commercial and military markets to be much more intertwined than they already are.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Melissa. This was a very, very important presentation. Thank you, Valerie, for moderation. Great questions. Hope everybody has a great rest of your days, and we look forward to seeing you in next week's installment of this virtual seminar series. Thanks again, Melissa. This was excellent.
Thank you.